Everyone in the high-stakes corporate world of Lagos knew the name Nathaniel Oseji, the billionaire tycoon who had carved a massive empire out of oil and technology. At 41 years old, he possessed every luxury that wealth could secure, yet his heart harbored a secret, persistent longing for a child. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass of his 20-story mansion, gazing out at the city lights while feeling a profound emptiness that mirrored his silent hallways. Though his phones constantly buzzed with the vibrations of billion-dollar contracts and his house was filled with the movement of staff, his soul felt utterly hollow. Nathaniel had navigated the treacherous waters of marriage twice before, and both times, he felt love had betrayed him. To him, feelings were a liability, sentiments that only served to obstruct the cold efficiency of business. He reached a cynical executive conclusion. If love could not provide him with an heir, he would simply acquire one through his immense wealth. He didn't want a relationship or a wife. He wanted a clinical agreement, a person to carry his legacy without the mess of emotional attachment. To Nathaniel, this was not a family matter. It was a transaction, a deal no different from a corporate merger. What he could not foresee was that this specific deal would lead him into a place where he found himself today. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comment section. The afternoon sun in Kumasi was a relentless hammer, beating down on the gridlock near the market until the air shimmered with heat and exhaust. Nathaniel Oseji sat in the back of his armored SUV, the climate control humming a soft, expensive tune that felt like a mockery of the struggle outside his window. He was checking a series of production reports on his tablet when the traffic ground to a complete halt, trapping him beside a faded, sun-bleached wall. That was when he saw her. Isioma Akoli was a stark contrast to the gray concrete and the vibrant, noisy chaos of the hawkers. She was sitting directly on the cracked sidewalk, her barefoot heels tucked beneath a red dress so tattered it seemed held together by sheer willpower. She wasn't holding a begging bowl or shouting for attention like the others. Instead, her head was bowed in intense concentration as she clutched a jagged stick of charcoal. With swift, sure strokes, she was breathing life onto a piece of crumpled paper, her steady hand seemingly immune to the dust swirling around her. Nathaniel lowered his tinted window just an inch. He expected to see the dull gaze of the defeated, but when Isioma looked up to brush a stray coil of hair from her face, her eyes met his through the gap. They didn't flicker with shame or plea. They burned with a raw, terrifying defiance that no amount of his oil money could manufacture. It was a gaze that belonged to a queen, trapped in the body of a girl the world had tried to erase. Something in Nathaniel's chest, a part of him he thought he had successfully buried under layers of logic and legalities, experienced a sharp, painful tug. The traffic light ahead shifted to green, and his driver prepared to move, but Nathaniel's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. He ordered a sharp U-turn, his mind already calculating the risk. He stepped out of the car, his cream-colored suit a blinding contrast to the grit of the street, and walked toward the girl who drew in the dirt as if she owned the very ground beneath her. The SUV came to a stop outside a quiet, secluded cafe nestled in the hills of Aburi, far removed from the sweltering chaos of the Kumasi market. Wind brushed through the mango trees, and birds chirped in a peaceful rhythm, blissfully unaware of the cold proposal about to be whispered in the shade. Nathaniel Oseji stepped out first, looking sharp and impenetrable in his tailored suit, his face a mask of executive indifference. He did not hold the door for Isioma, nor did he offer a smile. To him she was not a guest, but a potential asset. Isioma followed with visible caution, her arms crossed tightly over her tattered red dress as her eyes scanned the perimeter like she was walking into a trap. They sat in the farthest corner of the terrace, away from the few remaining customers. When the waiter brought drinks, neither touched them. The air between them was too thick with unspoken tension. Nathaniel leaned in, his voice low and as precise as a surgeon's blade. He told her plainly that he wanted her to carry his child. Isioma let out a short, hollow laugh of disbelief, But Nathaniel didn't blink. He folded his hands and explained that there would be no strings, no emotions, and absolutely no romance, only a contract. He laid out the clinical terms. He would cover every expense, provide a life of luxury for the duration, and once she gave birth, she would leave a very wealthy woman. To Nathaniel, this was a simple exchange of food, shelter, and a future for a vessel he deemed invisible and without history. Isioma's fists clenched under the table as the weight of the $100 million offer hung in the air. She felt the sting of being treated like a spare room for rent, yet as she looked at Nathaniel's locked gaze, she realized this cold man was offering her the only chance she might ever have to stop starving. The following morning, pride was finally buried beneath the suffocating weight of reality. The previous night had been a brutal reminder of her station. Isioma had lain curled beneath a ragged blanket on the cold stone steps of a closed shop, the wind cutting through her bones while her stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing emptiness. In the darkness, she had closed her eyes and seen only his face, Nathaniel Oseji, and the terrifying temptation of his offer, a child, money, and the freedom to never be hungry again. She hated him for suggesting it, but she hated the weakness of her own starving body even more. By dawn, she walked for hours until she stood before the towering black gates of his estate in East Legon. The entrance was polished and intimidating, guarded by men who looked at her tattered red dress with silent judgment. "I am here to see Mr. Oseji," she said, lifting her chin to keep her voice from trembling. Minutes later, the heavy gates groaned open, and Nathaniel appeared at the front door himself. He did not offer a smile or ask why she had returned. He simply stood there, waiting for the inevitable. Isioma looked him dead in the eye, her spirit flickering despite her exhaustion. "I'll do it," she whispered, "but I want it in writing. No tricks." Nathaniel nodded once, his expression as blank as a ledger. Inside, a thick envelope lay on a cold glass table, the contract already drawn and waiting for a signature. He handed her a pen, and though her hand shook with the gravity of the moment, she signed her name, Isioma Akoli. Just like that, the ink dried, and her life was no longer her own. She was no longer invisible, but she wasn't free either. She was purchased. Isioma sat in her private living room, staring at the untouched feast the chef had laid out on a tray of fine china. The room smelled of lavender and polished wood, with silk curtains that danced in the breeze, yet the air felt thin and suffocating. Within the walls of the 20-story mansion, her every physical need was anticipated before she could even speak. A personal nurse checked her vitals with clinical precision, and a driver stood by the gate like a silent sentinel, yet no one actually spoke to her with warmth. She had traded the dusty streets of the market for a palace, but the silence here was heavier than poverty. It was a golden cage where she felt less like a human being and more like a high-value asset being managed for maximum return. Nathaniel rarely appeared, and when he did, his questions were strictly operational. He would ask if the doctors were satisfied with her progress, never how she was feeling or what she was dreaming of. To him, she was a human briefcase, a vault designed to protect and deliver his future heir. One evening, as she stood by the massive glass window watching the city lights of the world she used to inhabit, she whispered to her reflection that she had escaped the streets only to step into a palace of ghosts. Nathaniel watched her from his study upstairs, observing her stillness as one might watch the fluctuating numbers on a stock ticker. He saw her shrinking under the weight of the isolation, but he remained unmoved. Emotions were not part of the contract, and in his world, only the delivery mattered. Days passed in a quiet, rhythmic precision that felt more like a golden cage than a sanctuary. Isioma moved through the marbled halls of the Oseji mansion like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only by medical vitals and scheduled meals. Though her physical hunger had been cured by a personal chef, her spirit remained famished in the heavy silence of the palace. Nathaniel remained a shadow, a distant figure who viewed her only as a biological investment. The silence finally broke one evening under the shade of a sprawling almond tree in the garden. Isioma sat on a stone bench, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air, a habit born from having no tools to capture the images in her mind. The soft crunch of gravel announced Nathaniel's approach. Expecting another clinical check-in regarding the doctor's satisfaction, she didn't look up. Instead of a cold command, a heavy, fragrant object was placed in her lap. It was a brand-new leather-bound sketchbook accompanied by a professional set of graphite pencils. Nathaniel stood over her, his usual surgical gaze softened by the golden hour light. He admitted quietly that he had noticed her drawings were fading and thought she might want better tools. Isioma blinked at the gift, her suspicion warring with a sudden surge of hope. When she asked why he would bother, he merely shrugged, claiming that idle minds grow restless. Yet, as they sat together in a silence that no longer felt like it was choking her, she noticed the way he folded his hands when uncertain. For the first time, she saw the man behind the tycoon, a man who was secretly watching her, not as a contract, but as a person. The sterile scent of the hospital room offered no comfort, only a quiet tension that settled over Nathaniel as he sat in a chair he hadn't planned to occupy. He had spent months convincing himself that Isioma was merely a vessel for his legacy, yet he found himself rescheduling his entire day just to witness a routine medical check. Isioma lay on the cushioned bed, her expression guarded as the doctor applied the cool gel to her growing belly. The monitor flickered to life with grainy shadows, a sight Nathaniel initially viewed with the detached eye of a man reviewing a balance sheet. Then the sound filled the room, a steady rhythmic drumming that echoed like war drums against the silence. It was the first heartbeat, sharp and undeniable. Nathaniel's eyes twitched, his clinical armor beginning to crack under the weight of a sound no contract could truly capture. But the doctor paused, adjusting the probe as the rhythm shifted into a complex, dual melody. A second heartbeat joined the first, distinct and powerful. The doctor beamed, announcing that the transaction was, in fact, twins. Isioma gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach, while Nathaniel remained frozen in a state of sudden, terrifying wonder. For the first time in 41 years, he wasn't looking at a merger or a calculated risk. He was looking at two lives, two futures, and a reality that finally forced him to see that Isioma wasn't just a business partner. She was the heartbeat of his entire world. The sterile scent of the hospital ward did nothing to mask the raw, electric tension of the moment. Inside the delivery room, the air was thick with the rhythmic, frantic beep of monitors that sounded like drums of war. Isioma lay on the bed, her face slick with sweat, her voice reduced to a ragged scream as she doubled over in the hallway of the mansion only moments before. Nathaniel Osage, the man who had built an empire on calculated detachment, was now completely shattered. He didn't stand in the corner with a checkbook, he was right beside her, his tailored cream suit wrinkled and forgotten. When the nurses tried to usher him to the waiting area, his voice was raw and real as he snapped that he was staying. Isioma's hand gripped his with a strength born of pure agony, her nails drawing blood from his palm, but he did not flinch. "Don't let go," she whispered through a sob, and for the first time in 41 years, Nathaniel made a promise that had nothing to do with profit. "I won't," he replied, his voice low and steady, anchoring her in the storm. As the first cry, sharp and pure, pierced the room, Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. Then came the second, louder and stronger. He watched, paralyzed with a sudden terrifying flood of wonder, as the nurse held up a son and then a daughter. In that blur of bright lights and fast-moving staff, the contract was no longer a document on a glass table. It was life, breathing, and perfect. Looking at Isioma, exhausted and broken yet alive with joy, Nathaniel realized the truth. No amount of wealth could have prepared him for the moment his heart finally woke up. The nursery was thick with the scent of lavender and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the twins, yet for Isioma, the air felt thin and cold. The contract was absolute. Once the children were born, she was to vanish, leaving behind no rights, no questions, and no trace of her presence. She stood at the edge of the crib, her hand trembling as it rested on the polished wood one last time before she reached for her small worn-out suitcase. Anita waited by the door, her eyes glossy with a silent plea, but Isioma only forced a heartbreaking smile. She had signed the papers, and she had given her word. Downstairs, the 20-story mansion felt like a tomb, devoid of the laughter that had briefly warmed its halls. She moved toward the front door, a storm of grief swelling in her chest, only to find Nathaniel blocking the exit. He wasn't the cold CEO who had scouted her in the dirt. His eyes glistened, and his jaw was set in a hard line of desperation. Without a word, he produced the single sheet of paper that had defined their lives, the contract, and began to tear it. He shredded the legal document into halves, then quarters, until the white scraps fell around her feet like confetti from a celebration they had never dared to have. "I don't want you to go," he whispered, his voice low and raw with a vulnerability he had spent 41 years hiding. Isioma froze as her suitcase hit the floor, her own tears finally spilling over. In that moment, the human briefcase and the tycoon were gone. There was only a man and a woman standing amidst the ruins of a deal, realizing they had accidentally built a family. The sun poured gently over the garden that once knew only silence, but now it held the music of laughter and the soft cries of two little miracles wrapped in white. Under the broad shade of a mango tree draped in celebratory cloth and flowers, Nathaniel Osage stood in a cream-colored agbada, his hand steady despite the racing of his heart. Beside him stood Isioma Akoli, radiant in a flowing gold and ivory dress that shimmered in the afternoon light. She held their baby boy, while Anita stood proudly nearby, cradling their daughter. There were no high-priced lawyers present today, no ironclad contracts, and no clinical terms to be met. This was not a wedding filled with grand displays for an audience, for they had learned that true love didn't need a gallery to witness its depth. It was simply a small circle of those who truly mattered, a family built from the wreckage of a transaction that had turned into a transformation. As the twins babbled into the warm breeze, the boy suddenly let out a sharp, pure sound, "Baba." Nathaniel froze, a look of pure wonder breaking across his face as Isioma turned to him with a gasp. Moments later, the girl joined in, squealing "Mama," into the golden air. Laughter and tears mixed freely as Nathaniel leaned in and kissed Isioma, a gesture filled not with the urgency of a deal, but with the peace of a man who had finally come home. They had survived the walls, the fear, and the coldness of the past. Now they were simply a family, their hearts tested and remaining true.